General Washington could be here today, he would be embarrassed. He was an extremely proud man and very particular in his appearance, but he was a modest man who would want no fuss made over him. He insisted that the marble statue completed in 1788 by the French celebrity sculptor Calhoun be done life-size, not larger than life, and not in classical garb, as many influential friends and who wanted. That graceful and powerful depiction of Washington stands about 135 miles east of here in the Capitol building in Richmond. It is perhaps the best likeness of Washington ever done. While president, he went to great lengths to avoid the never-ending ceremonies and speeches that were arranged in his honor as he traveled. He would try to sneak into town by a back route or out of town well before dawn to escape the honor guards and presentations and even more speeches. He was usually unsuccessful, but he had seen many scenes far more stressful in his staggeringly eventful life. So let me begin by describing a particular scene. It was the 3rd of July, 1754, at a place called the Great Meadow near present-day Pittsburgh. An almost complete military disaster was unfolding. George Washington was in command of about 400 men, which included colonials and maybe 100 British regulars, a total of about 285 effectives, who were attempting to defend a hastily thrown up small wooden stockade named Fort Necessity. Their attackers were nearly 3 times as many French regulars and Indian allies. On that sweltering, hot, and humid summer day, it had been raining for hours, often pouring. The soldiers were exhausted and hungry after a pell-mell 2-day forced withdrawal across the most wooded, creek-filled, and rugged mountainous terrain imaginable. Fort Necessity had no cover, and only about 1/4 of Washington's soldiers could fit inside the rude log structure. The rest crouched in even more crude earthworks, only knee-deep. Washington had earlier chosen the position, going so far as to call it a charming field for an encounter. Nonetheless, it was on low, boggy ground, partly surrounded by trees and boulder-filled higher ground that allowed ideal positions for an enemy to fire down into the fort at some points as close as 100 paces. The French arrived around noon. The Indians began to yell, and the French and Indians both began to fire from the edge of the woods. Washington drew up his men outside the fort, thinking that the enemy, with greatly superior force, would attack at once, and he would meet them on the open meadow. The French commander, Captain Louis de Bouillé, had another view. He later wrote, "We approached the English as near as possible, without uselessly exposing the lives of the king's subjects." Washington wrote, "They then, from every little rising, tree stump, stone, and bush, kept up a constant galling fire upon us. The French also shot every horse, every cow, and even the dogs around the camp, to deny the rain-soaked defenders their transport and their meat. The firing intensified toward evening until there fell in Washington's words the most tremendous rain that could be conceived. Any sense of order and subordination in the English force that had survived the hellish day now fell to pieces." The violent fight lasted 9 hours, with Washington's soldiers ending up in knee-deep water and mud, exhausted, nearly starved, drenched, with little ammunition and no dry powder. Washington had to now contemplate humiliation and utter defeat that could well end in the annihilation of his entire command. And then, About 8 o'clock, in the looming darkness and drenching downpour, there came a cry from the French, "Voulez-vous parler?" When the words were translated, Colonel Washington refused. After extremely tense minutes, the French asked again for a parley. This time, with 1/3 of his effectives dead or wounded, and only 2 bags of flour and a bit of bacon left, Washington accepted the surprising and almost assuredly saving French proposal. He may not have even been aware that his soldiers had also gotten into the rum supply intended for the Indians, and many were already drunk. Washington eventually agreed to and signed on a rain-soaked piece of paper a capitulation that allowed the English to leave without insult, to return to their own country with their belongings, except for artillery and munitions. They must strike their colors, but could march out of the entrenchments safely with their drums beating. Historians have justifiably faulted Washington for fighting before reinforcements arrived, for advancing instead of retreating, for the haphazard construction of his fort, for the high hubris in deciding that he could take on a far superior French force, for alienating his Indian allies and choosing an almost indefensible location. Now, Washington was by no means responsible for all the disadvantages he faced during this almost first engagement of what became the French and Indian of 7 Years' War. He had clearly inadequate support from Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia, from Virginia legislators, and from other colonies which had promised various aid. And he was only 22 years old at the time. Now pause for a moment and think about that age. What were you doing at 22 years old? I know that I could barely get my Navy ensign's uniform on straight, and due to the wisdom of my superiors, was thankfully responsible for little beyond that. But Washington, as he put it, was filled with a glowing zeal to rise in reputation and to show his mettle. Although he had already been spurned by the top, lofty, and condescending English in his attempts to gain a regular commission in the British Army, he had written, "My inclinations are strongly bent to arms." And he meant it. He was drawn to the orderliness of the army, and somehow the structure of the chain of command, and even to the uniforms, as he proved countless times in the extremely close personal attention he paid to his martial appearance and to the designing, tailoring, and fitting of his uniforms. In the first portrait ever made of him, and as far as Washington knew at the time, it would be the last, painted in 1772 by Charles Wilson Peale at the insistence of his wife, Martha, he posed in his uniform. And we're very fortunate that this wonderful painting, the original, is right here behind me. I think the reflection may make it difficult to see the painting from this side of the chapel. But it is a wonderful painting and almost enigmatic in a sense, because in the background it's the Allegheny Mountains, not Mount Vernon. And behind his shoulder there's a fowling piece, not a military firearm, which is curious. And you can see that he had on the uniform that he wore in the French and Indian War, which by legend had 3 bullet holes in the coat,